What is up guys, here's my patch 421 breakdown, and a lot has changed from the first preseason patch. Actually there is a lot, there are about 50 separate changes and I can't cover them all, so I'm gonna skip a couple that aren't as important and just focus on the ones that have a really big impact in your games. So the stuff I'm gonna cover in this video is what you actually need to know and understand to play. So let's jump into the first champion change, and that's gonna be to Cho'Gath. I actually think Cho'Gath's in an okay spot right now anyway. When he had his ultimate change, so there's no animation, so it kind of just surprise noms you straight away and does a big amount of burst damage. I actually think that was a really good change. It kind of brought him back a little bit. His jungling's okay, his top lane's pretty good, he's kind of this meta tank a lot like Maokai, and this change is really good because it means that you don't have to worry so much about whether you're going to feast for a stack or whether you need to save it for a team fight, because it should be up in time again. The one thing they don't think about Cho'Gath is that silence is really annoying if he layers it on you, and it's kind of impossible to dodge his Q after you're silent, so he can be a really annoying threat in teamfights. Now moving on to Corki. Corki's kind of been the staple best AD carry for a while now in bot lane, and especially with the Lucian nerfs that I'll talk about in a minute, Corki is definitely the best there is right now. This is going to hurt his lane phase a little bit. It's going to make it kind of easier to lane against him because it's easier to dodge his Q, but in teamfights it's really hard to dodge it anyway, so it's not really going to make a difference. So Fiddlesticks is a really strong jungler this patch. He has a really good clear speed, and his ultimate with the new items does so much damage, it's ridiculous. One thing that was always kind of funny is that his passive, you could kind of tell if he was around. If you were mid lane and he was sitting in the side brush, you can actually see from the debuff that he was sitting there waiting to ult on you. Now the good thing with this now, which makes more sense, is that when you actually deal magic damage to him, you're going to reduce their magic resistance, so it makes so much more sense. The E change is probably going to make his clear speed a little faster, but in general it's not really going to do too much because it was already applying the damage. It will just kind of separate evenly out now. The one thing that's going to make it easier to play against Fiddle though is that the silence isn't going to apply twice to someone, so it should make his ganking actually a little bit weaker. For those of you who have been following me for ages, you know that I actually loved playing Galio a lot in Season 2. Now this change is actually pretty cool because it means that he can be way more annoying and you can't really just bypass his ultimate to get into the back line. He's going to be a lot better at holding tanks in place, and so I actually think he's going to be good because he can hold them in place while your AD carry is beating them from behind. He works okay as a top laner, a mid laner and a support, so we're probably going to see a little bit more of him. Okay, so moving on to Jax, and remember not too long ago Jax was kind of the staple best top laner and pick or ban. These changes are okay, they make his late game more tanky, but honestly that's not where his problems are. His problems are early game with his base stats being pretty low. Jax struggles in lane against things that are in the meta right now, and so this change isn't really going to affect him too much. I mean, if you can survive the lane phase or even start winning, then this is going to make it even harder to shut you down in teamfights. This is something that's been in Jace's kit for so long, but people just didn't really play him, so I guess they didn't pick up on it. Now when I started playing Jace, I figured out that when you activate your W, the cooldown starts immediately, not when it ends, and so you could hold on to your W for a little while and basically use two of them in a row. It was really dumb and it was really overpowered, and especially now with the Mura mana change, this change makes sense because it's just too much power basically. It's actually going to hurt him quite a lot. You wouldn't have realised it because you wouldn't be thinking about it, but next time you play Jace, you'll realise your W is not up anywhere near as often. So here's the new Kalista change, and one change that I actually want to see that isn't in here is being able to rebind someone. I think it's actually pretty cool to have someone binded in lane and then have someone different binded for team fights, but the bigger thing is that when someone's DC on my team, my support, I can't then rebind it, so I can never use my W passive on someone again. Now speaking of her W, they've added this new thing where if a minion is below 125 health, it's actually going to automatically kill it when you proc Sentinel, and it's kind of a nice change, but honestly you need to learn to CS anyway, so this isn't really too big. The big change though is to her E, her rend. It's actually going to restore mana now if it kills a unit, which is kind of nice if you're going to miss a CS, but the bigger thing is her damage is actually increased quite a bit. Because of this, I actually am going to try maxing her E every time now. I think her E is going to be better to max because it is just a ton more damage, and if you're patient with it, you could really hurt level 1 or 2. I actually really love Kennen, so I'm going to make a point of this, but I don't think it's too big. It's more of a quality of life thing. Now the reason I think it's quality of life is because it's going to help him in team fights, but it's not really going to make too much of a difference. The big thing with Kennen is that people will pull their trigger on the W and use it too early. When you're in a team fight, you want to let these stacks apply from your ultimate and then press your W to get a few stuns. And this is actually going to help you do that a little bit because you apply the stacks quicker. So you surge into the middle of the enemy team, use your ultimate, W a couple of seconds later, and you should get a few stuns and do a ton of damage. Now I mentioned this earlier, but here's the Lucian change, and it does actually hurt him quite a bit. The biggest thing that's going to hurt is that you can't really poke and then decide to use your passive later. It's not going to hurt you as much in an all-in trade because you're using your passive straight away, but the part that will hurt there is the reduced damage, especially when you're kind of below level 7. When you hit level 7, it's not going to make as much difference. The 0.1 AD ratio is not too huge, and you probably have your Infinity Edge by then as well, which means the crits is kind of going to negate that ratio anyway. I actually expect him to fall down the rankings a little bit, and the cool thing is that Graves already destroyed Lucian, okay? And now with this nerf, he doesn't stand anywhere near Graves, so Graves is going to come back into the meta quite a lot. Now I don't play Sejuani too often, and I'm not going to lie and say I do, so I don't want to linger on these changes too much in case I offend someone who's a Sejuani main. What I can tell you is that they are shifting a lot of her damage from her upfront burst, where people were building her like AP, like DFG and stuff, and they're moving it into a kind of AoE damage in team fights, so basically you can't ignore her anymore. This is cool because when I play AD, the biggest thing I know is that she jumps in with her ultimate, you dodge that, and then you ignore her because she doesn't do any damage. With this, you don't actually need to build damage to do damage either, so you can be really tanky, really hard to kill, and still put out a good amount of AoE damage in a team fight, which is basically what you want. I mean, she has good clear speed, she has good ganking, great crowd control, and really tanky. That's pretty much the recipe for a good jungler, so I'm actually going to try her out. I think she'll be good this patch. But one person I do know who is going to be definitely good this patch is Shyvana. Now Shyvana has always been good since the preseason patch, but people aren't playing her as much because other people are just stronger, honestly. Now the good thing with this is that her clear speed is already ridiculous, okay? But when you combine it with this burnout change, it's actually going to be insane. All that lets you do is you full clear your jungle and then you can either gank, or you can go into the enemy jungle and find them, hunt them down and steal their monsters. Something a lot of people haven't thought about is you can actually build Stalker's Blade on her, which gives you the slow, kind of like having an exhaust on Shyvana. This is something that people do anyway, they run exhaust on her because she doesn't have any sticking power, she can't really stick to you, but Stalker's Blade lets you do that, so Stalkers into Devourer is actually really strong on Shyvana. Moving on to a slightly less of a change in Soraka. Now this isn't too big, but what they're doing is making it so that you can't spam your heal, you have to be a little bit more sparse with it and kind of choose when you're going to do it. To put this really simply, you can't heal as often, but when you do, it's going to heal for more. Okay, so let's look at Weedwick, and he's kind of plagued solo queue for this whole preseason patch, basically. And the first thing I want to say is he's actually still pretty good. He still has good clear, he still has good ganks after level 6, and he still does a lot of damage. He does a lot less damage than before, though. He can't 1v1 people that he shouldn't have been able to before, especially because of the nerf on his ultimate, but also the nerf to skirmishers. Now, when you put both together, that's actually a huge amount of damage reduced in him, and the W is actually going to affect your team fight a lot. It's something that kind of flies under the radar because you're not actively doing damage with the rest of your team, but you will notice it a lot more now when it fades, because as an AD carry, I love playing with Warwick because it increases my attack speed so much, and to have that almost reduced by half is a big hit to a team fight. Okay, so there are two more changes I want to talk about. First one, Yasuo, and then onto Zac. Now Yasuo has always been annoying, but he did have his early game nerf pretty hard. These changes are kind of somewhat going to help that a little bit because the Q spam means that you can farm a little easier, you get your tornado quicker, which means you can trade better. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Zac, and everyone's going to call me crazy, but Zac is my hidden overpowered jungler right now. He's really strong, he does a lot of damage, he has good clear speed, and he does have good ganks. The reason I think he's kind of overpowered is because he does everything you want in a jungler, in a tanky jungler, and he can carry solo queues so easy with his engages. I've always said that engage and crowd control wins games because you can pick fights for your team that are good and you can survive long enough and kill people anyway. This is exactly what Zac does, and his E is actually going to help him even more because when you jump into a team now, you're going to spawn more of these chunks, which means that you can pick them up and heal yourself back up and last even longer when you jump in. The ultimate change doesn't really change anything much apart from making him more annoying, but I actually think he's really good and he's a lot of fun too, so you should definitely try him out. So that's all of the champion changes out of the way. Now we're going to move on to objectives and kind of map changes, and there are a lot of small things here, but I'm going to focus on the main ones, the ones you need to know to play. Now the first one of these is the Baron change, now reducing the buff timer to 3 minutes instead of 4. It makes sense because not only is it a really powerful tool, but everyone knows that you have to group now with your minions. It's really obvious. You group with minions, you push, and you get something from it. The thing that's going to hurt you more now is what happens a lot in solo queue when a couple of you base to buy straight after Baron and a couple of you just go and kind of farm the lanes and then base. That extra 30 seconds to a minute that you waste because you're basing at different times is going to make much more of a difference now, so you need to base together straight after the Baron and then push. Now the other change is to Dragon. There are a couple of changes here, like you can't really juggle it anymore, you can't really level 2 or level 3. But the one I want to talk about is the first stack and the second stack of Dragon buff. Now they've changed the second and the fourth and swapped them around. So the second one now gives you 15% damage to turrets, and the first one only gives you 6% instead of 8%. It actually means that the first 2 dragon kills are really important, and if you can get them, you can snowball the game pretty hard. The extra 15% damage to turrets might not seem a lot, but when you have 5 people with that buff all hitting a tower, it really does add up. Alright, so finally let's move on to the jungle items. I kind of mentioned the skirmishers already and I'll come to that in a second. The first one I want to talk about is the Ranger's Trailblazer. This is the one I recommended everyone to get, and it's kind of not going to be true anymore. I think you should actually just do it based on the champion you're playing. The reason for that is because it now no longer reduces your smite cooldown by 15 seconds, so it's not as overpowered as it was before. It still gives you sustain, so if you're struggling early in the jungle, then the Ranger's Trailblazer is going to help you a lot. It's going to make sure you can gank more, it's going to make sure you can farm more, so I still recommend it there. But if you're a heavy ganker with some sustain, it's better to just get a Stalker's Blade. Okay, so then there's the Skirmisher's Saber nerf, and this is actually pretty big. So now it's just going to do true damage over 3 seconds rather than per hit. And while it's still going to be good for some attack speed junglers, like you can still use it on Yi and Warwick if you wanted to, there are also a ton of other options that are going to depend on the game, and Rangers is going to be good on those champions, and Stalker's Blade is going to be good too. The thing that still is going to make those junglers strong is the Devourer, and that can still be applied onto Stalkers or Rangers, so you don't necessarily have to have Skirmishers, and it's going to kind of come down to personal opinion. Now speaking of the Devourer, they've actually reduced the magic damage on hit, and it's again a nerf to attack speed champions, but it's still going to be better than Warrior for them. If you have a really fast clear time and you're going to be farming a lot, then Devourer is just the obvious choice. It's so much better than the others. But if you aren't going to be farming that much, then I would actually recommend getting Warrior now. So that wraps up my breakdown for 421, and I hope you guys kept up with me there. I kind of talked a little bit fast and I skipped over some things because there just is too much to talk about and not made the video ridiculously long. I hope you enjoyed the video anyway. If you did, feel free to leave a like, and I'll catch you next time.